To introduce today's speaker, I'd like to welcome Barbara Barker, and I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which I stand, the Ngunnawal people. I would like to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this region, the ACT. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands of you, our online participants, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be participating in today's webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's webinar is titled Supporting and Engaging Families During COVID-19. What have we learned? The webinar, of course, comes at a time when the nation is emerging from lockdown due to the current pandemic. Work, schooling, all teaching has been transformed. Life has not been normal. And we thank you for participating today during this odd period of transition and reflection. While webinars are increasingly normal for many of us, many would-be participants will not have the time or resources to take part today. So we and Catholic Education Melbourne will make the recording freely available soon. Today's webinar, as mentioned, is being delivered by Parent Engagement Specialist and Research Manager Barbara Barker. Barbara is a social research specialist with over 20 years experience across the non-profit, private and government sectors. Prior to joining ARACY, Barbara was a consultant to federal government clients, making significant contributions to programme evaluation, social marketing and service delivery development across a diverse range of social research and policy areas. I'm going to turn on the camera now so you can see Barbara. And I will happily hand over to her to start today's presentation.
Thanks, Dale. Hello everyone, you can see me now, hopefully. I'm sitting here in our office in Canberra and it's the first time I've been here for a while, so it feels very odd. Been working from home, which is a very fortunate position to be in. Before I start, I'd like to thank Dale for his acknowledgement of country and echo his words. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand. And I'd also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be listening to this presentation. I know that most of you, our participants, are based in Melbourne on Wurundjeri land, so we also pay our respects to the traditional owners of the Kulin Nation also. I'd also like to thank our friends at Catholic Education Melbourne who invited me to present today. ARACY has worked closely in the parent engagement space for about 8 years now, since 2012. And more recently, we finished working on a large project that was commissioned by the Australian Government Department of Education. Through that work, an extensive body of research was conducted, which culminated in our family engagement implementation guide for school communities, it's all freely available on our website. So I'd encourage you to please take a look if you're interested in that and let me know what you think. We've tried to make it as practical as possible for schools and for teachers, and there's quite a lot of content in there, but there's also a lot of practical examples which may be of use. So we've got a lot to cover in the next little while. You're looking at the outline at the moment, and I'm just going to switch off my camera now so that I can have a look at what I'm looking at. By way of an outline, here's what I'd like to discuss in the next 40 minutes or so. I'd like to give us enough time to have a really decent discussion at the end. So importantly, what I'm not going to focus on is the importance of making family engagement a core part of school business rather than adding it on when there's time. We do think that that's vital, making it a core part of business, but that's what our implementation guide is all about, and that it's not really the focus of today's session. Instead, we'll talk about ARACY's research in the family engagement area, some of our thinking around working with families and some key considerations there. But what I really want to focus on is how we're going to use this incredible opportunity of the past 2 months to strengthen our practice in family engagement going forward. Put simply, how has the period of remote learning influenced our family engagement practices? And what can we take away from this experience as we transition back to school-based learning again? What have we learned? I don't claim to have all the answers today, but I'd really like to spend a good chunk of time discussing this opportunity with you at the end of my presentation. So do think about your questions as you go, and as Dale mentioned, please feel free to start writing them into the question panel. And we'll have some of the team from the Student Wellbeing Unit down your way in Catholic Education Melbourne joining us for that a bit later on. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. This webinar really comes at a time when everything to do with education and learning is being turned on its head, as Dale mentioned, and these have really been quite remarkable times, haven't they? We now find ourselves emerging from our homes to head back into schools if we're educators and students, perhaps not so much if we're parents or caregivers. As parents, we've been asked to send our children back to school again after 2 months in our family care, but at the same time, we've been asked to keep our own distance from schools physically. It's easy to imagine the sorts of emotions that may be running high for families at the moment, and particularly this week down in Melbourne, and particularly in your diocese. Here in the ACT, we've had children heading back to school for the past few weeks now, and we see that the locus of control has really shifted back to schools and teachers, particularly as we haven't been able to drop into school or spend time with other parents at drop-off or pick-up as we may normally do. That sense of community does feel a bit like it's gone at the moment. Most schools are in that strange position of needing to direct parents and caregivers to stay in their cars or not to enter school grounds and to leave by the time school starts so that gates can be closed. One person here commented that corridors and car parks are empty. And I mean, this is challenging for everyone, especially as we've all been grappling with how best to be the parents and carers we want to be in these times. And educators and school leaders have thought very carefully about how to respond to best support students and their families during the shutdown. At ARACY, we like to use the nest, which I've got on the screen at the moment, to think about the different aspects of children's wellbeing. And this has been especially useful at stressful times like these. Some of you may know about the nest. It's an evidence-based wellbeing framework for young people. And it says that for an Australian child to have truly high wellbeing, they must be doing well in 6 key interlocking dimensions. And as you can see there, those are being loved and safe, being healthy, learning, having material basics, participating, and having a positive sense of identity and culture. The research tells us that children and young people need to be doing well in each area to truly thrive. So while the healthy learning and perhaps material basics domains have probably been front of mind during isolation and the shutdown period, particularly for families and for parents, the nest reminds us that we need to be thinking about some other things as well to ensure we're holistically supporting our students' wellbeing. Our CEO, Penny Dakin, wrote a blog about this, and I've put a link to it down the bottom of the slide here. You might find that interesting. So this holistic sense of wellbeing for young people is just something to keep in mind as we work through this session. And of course, Catholic Education Melbourne has the EXCEL Wellbeing for Learning in Catholic School Communities framework designed to strengthen children and young people's wellbeing and learning outcomes. And we'll touch on a bit more on that in a moment. So over the last 5 years, since 2014, ARACY's been working on a significant project funded by the Australian Government Department, as I said, of Education, Skills and Employment, the Parent Engagement Project, or the PE project as we called it. And throughout the project, ARACY worked with a range of stakeholders, researchers, schools, educators, agencies and practitioners to learn, gather and understand what makes the difference when it comes to implementing successful family engagement practices in school communities. We conducted a conference in Melbourne in 2017, and some of the team members from Catholic Education Melbourne presented at the conference. And I'd like to briefly touch on some of the main reasons why we think family engagement matters and why we need to talk about it, although I recognise that most of you are a very enlightened audience today. So research from the past 50 years has established that families matter. We know they play powerful roles in both what and how children learn, which makes their engagement in learning a strong predictor of a young person's development, their educational attainment, and success in school and life. We also know that learning doesn't just happen at school, of course. Learning happens anywhere, anytime. At school, at home, in the community, after school, and during summer holidays. So families are supporting and encouraging learning continually. They also matter because learning never stops. So the ability for families to provide that support from the early years right through secondary school and beyond is invaluable. And clearly it will look different as a child develops and progresses through school, but the family's engagement in that child's learning remains vitally important throughout. Awareness is relatively low. There are relatively low levels of awareness about the impact of parents on a child's learning and development. It sounds crazy to say that, but we found this to be true through the research we've conducted. And while all families come with their own experience of learning, of being at school, there can be a lot of misunderstanding, emotional baggage, fear, that sort of thing. Families don't often realise that they're actually doing parent engagement or family engagement really well. It's not often recognised and therefore it's not always reinforced or celebrated. And teachers aren't trained specifically in forming relationships with their families for the benefit of student outcomes. It's not a key focus in teacher college, and it may happen through mentoring or on-the-job training, but that's not guaranteed. Our research with families and educators and even school leaders has consistently shown a mixed bag of assumptions and beliefs regarding family engagement, about what it is, what it means to them. And so there is still a long way to go to embed that understanding. We know that capacity building is needed. I'll touch a bit more on this further on, but we know that despite its positive impacts on learning and wellbeing outcomes for students, and that there's the ARACY standards for teachers in family engagement, 3.7 and 7.3, for example, training and development in this area can be a little bit mixed. This can be a significant issue in school communities where there might be a cultural disconnect between families and teachers. Some educators aren't equipped with the skills and confidence to understand the different perspectives on learning that families might have. And this can prevent families from feeling included in the school community and might reduce their engagement in their child's learning. To improve the confidence and skills of teachers in things like cultural awareness, we know that building their capacity is key to shifting mindsets, to developing resources for families and improving their confidence in drawing on parents' interests and capacities for student outcomes. So what is family engagement in learning? I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I do think it's worth addressing several key points here before we go any further. A fundamental aspect of family engagement, and one that many understandably grapple with, is that by its very nature we're often talking about something that isn't always seen. Family supporting and encouraging their child or young person is something that tends to happen away from or outside of school, in homes, in cars, in communities, like it has been doing over the past 2 months, particularly anywhere that families spend time together in everyday activities. And we often hear labels like parent or family involvement used interchangeably with engagement. And I'm sure many of you have become aware of these issues through the work of the student wellbeing team. These aren't just labels. We think that they're worth discussing a bit further because we see them as different things, and certainly a lot of the engagement experts out there do as well. We find there's often a misunderstanding about what engagement in learning really is. Parents or families' engagement with their child's learning may not equate to and shouldn't be judged on the basis of engagement with the school. And many parents, particularly those from ethnic backgrounds or minorities, or those facing economic challenges, you may well know, may find engagement with schools difficult, but they may still have a strong desire to be involved in their child's learning and education. One way of thinking about this is as a continuum, moving from involvement with a school to engagement with child's learning. So that takes away the emphasis from the relationship between parents and schools to a focus on the relationship between parents or families and their child's learning. Schools can find themselves at different points on this continuum with different activities or with different cohorts of parents. And one of the things I like to emphasise here is that parent engagement can never be complete. A school can never say, we've done that and it's done, because each school new year brings new cohorts of parents and children's needs change as they develop, and parent engagement with their learning needs to adapt to those changes. And what's interesting about all of this, of course, is that for the past 2 months, learning has really been flipped as students and their families being in the position of driving, as students and their families have been in the position of driving how learning will take place, when learning will take place, where learning will take place, and if indeed it will take place. And this has really provided a bit of a golden opportunity to perhaps redesign and reimagine the process of teaching and learning. We can now quite easily incorporate families into the lessons, not just incorporate them into the instructions. So there's been an opportunity, I guess, to leverage family efficacy to sustain momentum in student learning, because we know, and particularly those of us who work in the Catholic education system know that families are the first and most influential teachers of their children. Okay, so I just want to touch on the engagement triangle. Sometimes we refer to family engagement in learning as a triangle with students, families and schools at each point. And each party needs a strong relationship with the other two parties working together to support the child or young person's learning. And schools need to be able to embed systems and structures so that family engagement in learning, the engagement triangle, is strengthened. And on this slide here, I just wanted to show your beautiful Excel framework. And that has a very similar focus. It's also highlighting the importance of strengthened relationships between home and school to ensure strong learning outcomes for students. So I know that a lot of you are all over this content already. Sometimes people like a bit of a definition, and this is the ARACY definition of family engagement in learning. I'll just give you a moment to read that. This is something that we have conceptualised for our implementation guide, and the operative words here are really the capacity of families to support learning in partnership with schools. And now more than ever in this current situation, this is why it matters, because it's based on the understanding that while children learn in all kinds of different environments, at the centre of these interrelated systems is that dynamic between parents and families and their children. Child-parent interactions that nurture positive attitudes towards learning, confidence as learners, and the development of subjective learning resources equip children to succeed. Not families being teachers themselves, that certainly isn't the focus. So prior to the shutdowns, if schools and educators hadn't empowered families to play an active role in their child's learning, then the period of remote learning may have been a struggle particularly if a relationship hadn't been forged between home and school beforehand in those first few weeks of term. A couple of months ago, as the shutdown was starting to happen, Dr. Debbie Pusher, and some of you will know her work quite well, she's certainly visited Australia a number of times. She tweeted that with the current picture of distance learning and teachers staying connected with students and families, they have a rich opportunity to make visible for parents all of the curriculum outcomes they're naturally realising as they cook with their kids, read, tell stories and discuss the news. I think that's a really lovely tweet. Okay, so I'd like to just talk very briefly about engaging with families and some of the fundamentals that we like to stress. Let's turn to what this means for staff and how capacity building is important given what we know about the need for professional learning in this area. The challenge is here that often educators are not specifically trained in forming relationships with their students' families for the benefit of learning outcomes. So in any teaching team, we find a spectrum of skills and comfort with this, and varying degrees of value placed on these skills by individual staff. Some of you may have been at the conference in 2017 when ARACY hosted a number of international parent engagement experts. And one of the experts that was there was Dr. Karen Mapp, who works out of Harvard Graduate School of Education. And during her wonderful keynote, she asked a room of about 400, 500 participants how many of them were delegates, how many of the delegates were educators. And a great deal of hands went up. The majority of the audience put their hands up. And her question to that group of people was who's received specific professional development or professional learning in forming partnerships with families. And only a very small proportion of that wider group put their hands up. And she sees this happening a lot, quite sort of often in her presentations, and she travels the world sort of significantly. And so that wasn't particularly surprising for her to see that. And I think if you haven't already had a chance to have a look at our conference materials and resources, they're still available on our PEC Australia, PEC, which was the Parent Engagement Conference Australia website. It was pecaustralia.com, and it's worth having a look at the video of Karen Mapp at our PE conference. Sometimes it's seen as softer work rather than a skill that staff need to build capacity in. But as I'm going to touch on a bit later, a recent report from the Frameworks Institute shows that there tends to be a reduction of engagement into highly personal terms, kind of saying that it's something that just comes down to relationships between individuals, that, you know, some people are just better at it than others. And this is something we think is far too narrow a focus, because it excludes that this sort of work is a formal part of the staff role, and that staff do need opportunities to learn and to practice and to build capacity. We know that family engagement is about relationships, and this is why family engagement will always need to stem from a personalised, relationships-based approach, contextualised for each setting, that changes and develops as families move through a school. So for that to happen successfully, schools need to embed appropriate structures and provide the resources and the supports required by their staff, be they educators and all other staff, to sustain engagement practices. I just want to talk quickly about the work of Janet Goodall. She's a professor that works out of the UK. She's based in Wales at the moment. And I really like this quote from Dr. Goodall. She spends a lot of time working with communities facing disadvantage, so quite vulnerable families. And she talks about the need to build the capacity of staff. It's necessary The reason it being necessary is that we wouldn't expect staff to be able to teach a new curriculum without support and training. So why would we expect staff who are highly trained, competent professionals in one area to be competent in another without further knowledge and training? Working with parents or other adults requires knowledge and skills that teachers need to acquire, just as they did the knowledge and skills for working with young people. I'd just like to quickly take you through some thinking that we did for our implementation guide, which was around where educators might actually sit in regards to engaging with families. We know that the majority of school leaders believe that engaging parents and families is the responsibility of staff, but we also know that educators receive little explicit training on how to engage families. And nor do many schools have a plan for how they'd like staff to work with parents and families. In fact, a recent study out of the UK showed that only about 10% of schools had a plan. We also know from our research with the Australian Council for Deans of Education that there's minimal coursework provided in initial teacher education courses. So although that's changing, we know that is changing, but these things do take time. So there's almost an assumption that teachers just know how to engage parents and families effectively. We've been thinking about how the spectrum of value of family engagement and comfort with family engagement might look among school staff teams. And we know that there are some who are very comfortable with it, and that can typically come with experience, of course, time in the role. But there are also people who may have that experience but don't perceive it as particularly valuable. Certainly come across teachers who sit in all of these quadrants. And I think this first quadrant that I've marked here in green is probably, it's our ideal state, that these are teachers that we can probably think of, that they're informed and knowledgeable about, that they appreciate the effort and the value that's associated with good family engagement, and they feel supported by their school leadership. These are people who would, what we call, make an excellent action team member, and that's kind of some language that's in our implementation guide. The people who also are highly comfortable with it but may form a bit of a risk are people who perceive it as a low value. So they're comfortable with it and they're very good at forming relationships with their students and their families, but they might not appreciate that link between student outcomes and student success and family engagement. They might not fully recognise the effort and the worth of their own engagement actions. They just see it as something they're good at and that's how you do it, but probably don't appreciate that some will need training in it. And clearly the school would be at risk when these sorts of staff move on and leave with those excellent skills. So they kind of also need to be, I guess, trained to realise the value of their actions. Others that might also be a little bit at risk are those that have, they see the value, but they have low comfort. So they might feel anxious about engaging with some families. They might require a bit of extra support and professional learning, and they would definitely benefit from established school-wide procedures. The ones that we would be most concerned about would be those that don't see it as a valuable exercise and also have low comfort. And there's a lot of work that would be required there. They might see family engagement as a nice to have, but it's a low priority, and they might not realise just how important the link is between engagement and achievement. I think at a systems level, priority needs to be placed on building the capacity of the education sector through universal pre-service and in-service professional development, peer support, rewards and recognition for success, and stronger networking opportunities. And within schools and clusters, we need to work with staff and parents on reflective practices and overcoming assumptions. And we also need to share the load. We need to make sure that family engagement doesn't always fall to that teacher who's in that green square, the ones that are seen as good at that sort of thing, not always landing on their shoulders. And look, I know that you've got lots of really excellent information and resources for family engagement available to you through Catholic Education Melbourne, and I understand you've got something called the Kevin, the CEVN website, so I don't want to repeat too much here, and I know many of you will be across all of this thinking. I think there are two things that are worth emphasising today before we move on to the stuff that we really want to talk about. And I think that's that we need to make sure we look inward, that we check our assumptions, particularly about families, knowing what our implicit biases are. But we also need to carefully consider the conditions for engagement. So just on this slide here, I've just cut and pasted something from, well, it's not my original work, but as I say, it's in our implementation guide. It certainly is the work of Karen Mapp, and it was in the book Beyond the Bake Sale, which many people will know, and I've put the source down below there by Anne Henderson. Looking inward as an intentional practice is a really valuable exercise, and we talk about doing this as a staff group. And through team discussions, we can obviously become aware of our own and others' experiences, hopes, fears, concerns. Karen Mapp wrote this set of core beliefs about families that she developed for Beyond the Bake Sale. And there's 4 there, and I think many people would say, yeah, of course I believe these things. I do believe families have dreams for their children, and I do believe families have the capacity to support their children's learning. Yes, families and school staff. I mean, it's easy to say yes, yes, yes. But I think these core beliefs are probably worth really delving into with staff in a discussion, as a discussion group. And they can be a starting point to discussing our own assumptions and our experiences. And beyond that, we could have some other questions to statements like, thinking back to your own childhood. How was your family connected or not connected to school? How might your own personal experiences, positive or negative, shape your beliefs as a staff member or educator about family engagement? What fears, hesitation, apprehensions do you have about your work? What barriers do you have to overcome? Those sorts of things. So I think looking inward and looking at our assumptions is a really important part of what we're talking about here. Secondly, I've got a table I've put up here, and this is to do with framing messages about family engagement. So before we delve into looking at transitioning back to the classroom, I'm keen to just touch on this creating the conditions for engagement. I mentioned it just briefly earlier about how recent research tells us that the way we frame discussions and messages about family engagement in learning matters enormously. When I say here on the left, page 28, that's in reference to our implementation guide. The research emphasises that to grow support for family engagement, everyone must understand why it's so important to children's success, and there's some ideas here for consideration. I think the point that I just wanted to make here is that what I was saying before, that there's been a tendency to think about engagement in highly personalised terms that sort of take away formal and more institutionalised ways of promoting engagement. So rather than seeing family engagement in learning as being about every adult in a child or young person's life working together to help them reach their potential, it's often seen as coming down to a caring teacher or a great principal, or just boiling down to relationships between individuals. So there's some points here about how it can be unhelpful to think in certain ways and ways we might change that to benefit family engagement messages. Okay, I'll move on from there. I'd really like now to snap back to what we're all here to talk about, which is transitioning back and what we've learned. And this week your schools have been transitioning back to school-based learning. And this is a really this is a really critical time. I think it's really worthy of significant reflection at an individual level, but also at a school community level. Schools were obviously under enormous pressure in March to respond quickly to pandemic shutdowns and come up with remote learning options. We saw things happen in the education system which would normally take a lot longer to happen very swiftly, and that's very exciting, and it's good news. It also resulted in an integrated dependency on families to support learning, and as one expert overseas put it, and then COVID-19 showed up and family engagement took centre stage, and he's from America, so I can get away with him spelling centre that way. But yeah, schools and educators did step up, and so did families, and that opportunity has given educators and families alike rich insights to understand each other's respective worlds a lot more. I think enormous benefits have come from that. I've heard many talk about this sort of newfound empathy from being able to walk in each other's shoes. Of course, it hasn't all been plain sailing. We know that there's been frustrations, concerns, challenges with families juggling their own work commitments while supervising and supporting the learning requirements of their at-home students. Certainly I was in that situation. Felt like I wasn't doing either job very well. And of course, children and young people of all ages and abilities present their own sets of challenges with remote learning, and this hasn't just been limited to very young students or students with special needs. But there was praise for schools and teachers from parents. States added pupil-free days, and many educators worked over the Easter break to make their lessons function in a new way. We've got a quote here that was taken from an article on the ABC News, and I've put the link down there to the rest of the article. So this person was obviously feeling very optimistic about things and could see how hard the school had worked to try and make things work for remote learning. And there was always also a sense from educators of a shift in how families are perceived and their roles in supporting learning. This was a quote I'm taking from Twitter from a primary school teacher here in the ACT that I follow. And she was really responding to that sense of forming such close bonds with the parents of her students in a way that didn't happen when school was running normally. How will I cope not talking to them every day when we return? She'd just woken up to the most beautiful email from a parent, and it got her thinking about how they had been checking in on her. How are you going? How are things going for you? And realising that families were so happy to help, and that she would find it really kind of weird not being able to contact them every day. So I thought that was really, really lovely, and she was obviously quite surprised by that too. Something else I wanted to share with you here was something that came from a public school here in the ACT, which was a really beautiful infographic that was sent to all the families within the school. It was designed very, very quickly, swiftly, so that families could get a grip on what the focus was for the school and from the school. And I really like how they were able to emphasise that right in the middle there, how home learning works. So first and foremost, you're the people best positioned to know what's happening at home and where everyone is emotionally and practically. So really leveraging that parent knowledge. What home learning involves is some structure, a little time for formal learning, and an abundance of play. So it's really about that wellbeing aspect as well. And I really love down the bottom, please remember first, take care of your family's health and wellbeing as your own. Home learning is not about tuning home into school or parents into school teachers. We're here to support you with your child's learning. So that was really lovely as well. I just wanted to share that with you. And of course, teachers and parents from schools across the Archdiocese of Melbourne also shared their experiences of learning, remote learning. That quote was, this quote was copied from an article that was circulated in the recent Student Wellbeing Update, number 3, to you all a few weeks ago. It's just been a great opportunity to see exactly what he is doing at school. So this is the mother of a grade 1 student. I've gained valuable insights into him as a learner, and I feel more able to express my observations and be listened to as well. I know a lot more about where he's at with his learning, where his strengths and weaknesses are. I feel I can support him more effectively than I would have been able to previously. I know a number of other resources were also circulated at that time, and you've had this beautiful poster of family engagement resources. I think it's really amazing that you could fit all of it. It's clearly a lot of information there, but it's all on the one page, which is exactly what you'd want. And of course, you've had the tips for engaging and supporting families as well. So that's really good. You've also had this reflection tool sent to you, and this is what we're really focused on today. Thinking about all the things and the learnings from the period of remote learning and really working through those to support that transition back to school. I think this period has been an enriching experience. I think there's been challenges, but in the challenges, it's worth thinking about, well, what have we learned? So in terms of your enable domain, you've been able to ask yourselves, what needs to be in place to support families as we transition back to school-based learning? What's working well and what can be improved to support the relationship now and through transition back to school-based learning? What should be continued or improved to help families stay engaged through the transition back to school-based learning? And of course, what have we learned about family engagement that will inform our approach to this teaching beyond this period? So I guess it's what are the things we want to keep doing? What can we be letting go of? I had a wonderful discussion yesterday with the team in the student wellbeing unit, and one of the comments made was that we don't want to make any assumptions about what this experience has been like for families. There might be some things we'd like to keep going and some we'd like to let go of, but for others it may be different. And that goes for families as well. And we need to make sure that if we're genuinely bringing the family perspective in and inviting families to tell us what the experience has been like for them, we need to make sure we do that rather than assuming what it's been like from the vocal few that have come into school to tell us or who've contacted us. And I guess the point we'd like to make here is that we need to be thinking about ways in which we enable all families to have a voice, not just the vocal ones or the ones who might complete a survey. I know that part of the Catholic Education Melbourne ethos is honouring partnerships with families. So when we talk about that, what do we mean? We've had windows into our families' worlds through this time, haven't we? We've had video links. Teachers have had opportunities to observe the sorts of environments, atmospheres that their students are in. You know, they wouldn't have had this insight before, sort of 2 months ago. We've been able to see where children are sitting when they're checking in with their teacher. Are they in the main room, the living room, with other things going on, or do they have a dedicated quiet space with all the things they need? We've seen that unique situation that a young person would find themselves in, and we can think about the individual circumstances of each student. We talk about developing that whole child, a personalised approach for each student. So my question and our question to each of the participants is, how does that appreciation and insight into families of each student enable us to develop a personalised approach to the way that we engage with each family to support young people? Clearly there isn't one size fits all, and this would have been beautifully highlighted when talking to each of the families and students We can't put them in the one basket. There needs to be a personalised approach. So what insights have you developed about families that you didn't have 8 weeks ago? And how will you change your practices as a result? The way that you perhaps interact with the family and the young person, and how is that being strengthened to inform the pedagogy, the communication, those sorts of things? What has been the experience from a family's point of view of the past 8 weeks or so, where young people have been at home? How are you going to go about finding that out? How do we empower and capture the voices of families and their experience through this period? I mean, there are lots of techniques that I can think of as a researcher, focus group discussions, surveys, individual conversations with families, that sort of thing. There's certainly a range of techniques. If we're authentic in the way that we position family voice within the school community, then we need to be authentic in capturing the good and I guess the not so good, but also the ideas that families have got in terms of how we might be able to do things better. How do we honour those voices to then inform and improve school practice? This needs to be a really genuine exercise, I think, in harvesting the information and the knowledge and respecting that within the school community as well. So that's kind of where I'd like to finish. I've just got a final quote here from Janet Goodall. And this was from Twitter, and I think it's a nice point to finish with. She said, in thinking about more students getting back to school, please consider asking families what they've been doing and learning over the lockdown. Start from an asset-based model and be prepared to go from there. Okay, so it's time for some Q&A now. Thanks for listening, and I hope that that's given you something to think about for the coming days and weeks as things transition back to school-based learning. It's time for your questions now, so let's turn to you. We've also got some of the student wellbeing team here, so we'll bring them in at this point, and I'll just pop.
So we've enabled your microphones, panelists, and encourage you to turn on your cameras if you wish. I'm just turning on the camera for Barbara as well.
Thank you, Dale.
And thank you for starting to pose your questions.
I'll just quickly introduce the team that we've got here. I'm sure most of the participants know better than they know that I know anyway. So we've got Narelle, we've got Lena, and we've got Veronica from the student wellbeing team. Hopefully you can see them all, and me.
Narelle, you're muted at the moment, but Lena and Veronica, your mics are on.
Yep. Oh, that's good. Thank you, Narelle. We can hear you now. Before we turn to any questions, would any of you lovely ladies down in Melbourne like to make any comments or say anything before we start to respond?
Thanks, Barb, for your presentation this afternoon. We'll do a bit of a formal thank you towards the end of the session, but I think what you've really reinforced for us so far is that it's really incumbent on all of us in our roles, whether it be in schools or at a systems level, to create some opportunities that have really emerged out of this COVID-19 period. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. I think it's that the catalyst and the imperative that sits with all of us now to revert back to our old ways of doing things, but that we really need to develop, I suppose, some better strategies and better ways for engaging with families as a result of this period that we've been through.
Absolutely.
Just a quick comment. I really love that focus on assumption, the word assumptions. And it's perhaps a big danger that we assume lots of things and start creating resources and thinking and planning but they'll be based on assumptions unless we really delve deeply into the professionals and into families' experiences and responses. So it's a really timely reminder that that's critical.
Yeah, I would agree, Veronica, and I really like the point, Barbara, that you made about interdependency and this idea that there's always been an interdependency between students, their family and their teacher. But what has happened through the COVID experience is that that's really put that onto centre stage, as Dr. Steve Constantino said. And we can choose, I suppose, at this time, we're at a really critical juncture at the moment, we can choose to let that go and slide back into our normal way of operating. We can grab this opportunity and really think about what are the things that have been incredibly valuable in providing insight into each other's worlds and into the students' lives at home and at school for each other, for both parties, and seeing what we can, hang on to, because that relationship is so valuable in taking us forward into the next part of learning when everyone's back on site. So too good to let go of, I think.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. Now I'm just looking, we've got a few really interesting questions coming through. So we'll start with this one. Will there be a sample survey we can use once all students have returned to use with our families? I'm not sure if I can answer that one. I'm wondering if this is really about the schools in the diocese and whether there's anything there. One of you like to take that question?
I'd just like to say, why not?
I know that there has been, as we're moving through different phases of the response to COVID, and now that schools and that students and staff are returning to the school sites, the focus is shifting now to really try to capture the learnings. And I would imagine that in the coming weeks that there will be some further conversations around discussing how do we actually learn from this experience? What does it mean for our practice into the future? And whilst there's benefit of capturing that at a systems level, I think it's also important for schools to reflect on how might they be able to celebrate and capture the experiences with their families and their students over this period within their own school community. So perhaps that question needs to be addressed at both levels, at an individual school level, so that the context of that school can be fully captured and articulated, but also then feeding that into a broader system understanding of what our school communities have learned.
Okay. I'm a family engagement leader and I really like the questions you posed to spark discussion amongst staff. In what ways do you think leadership needs to be supporting staff with developing that personalised relationship with parents during a time when we don't and won't physically see them for a long period of time? Any ideas?
I think perhaps just as a starting point, and it's really off the top of my head, but it's going to be important that this is built into staff meeting structures or structures across the rest of perhaps the term, but and into the third and fourth terms, because it won't be done because we've done it once in a staff meeting or in a session at some point, or one person's following it up. It has to be an ongoing piece of work, and therefore will need to be, where possible, timetabled into structure. So it's going to be hard to get that on the agenda, but that's going to be some of the critical work that we'd love to see happening, that pushing it as high agenda item.
Yeah. I had a funny conversation with a friend of mine who's a teacher, not in a Catholic school, and she hasn't really loved the remote learning engagement. She's an arts teacher, and she hasn't really loved the online delivery of education. It's been quite challenging, and one of the things that her school has required of all of their teachers is what we would hope all teachers do, which is make phone calls home to students, but because she works with students right across the school, it's been quite a challenging time for her and very time consuming to do that from home. And she made a comment to me, and that comment was, her comment was, I can't wait to get back to school so that I don't have to make these phone calls anymore. So I imagine, and it goes back to what you said a little bit earlier, Barb, I imagine that there will be a real mix of experiences across the staff group as well as the parent group. And I think the starting point in terms of supporting leadership needs is to really gauge where staff are at. What's that experience been? What's worked well for them? What hasn't worked well? From a capacity building or a supportive sort of approach, think about where it has not gone as well for some staff as others. What are some of the things that that could be helpful in bringing those staff on board so that they don't think that as soon as the doors close and parents are no longer allowed in the school, that they can pretty much drop that relationship and it doesn't matter anymore.
And just on that point then, we've had a comment, a question and a comment. As our schools start to plan how we can capture the learning, will the Catholic Education Office in Melbourne be continuing to provide the student wellbeing weekly updates of resources that we can draw on to plan opportunities to engage with our students and families?
Look, that's a great question, and certainly over term 2, it's been fantastic to be able to support schools through the updates that have been coming out regularly every couple of weeks. And you'll notice that through the updates we've had different themes, and those themes have also aligned to the webinars that have been offered throughout the term. So we'll certainly look for new and creative ways to continue to support staff in schools. And family engagement continues to be a key priority within the Excel framework. So we will continue to work with you and look to develop those updates. What they look like into the future, I think, is a little bit of an evolving space as well, because that has been drawn together relatively quickly over this COVID time. So I'd hope that we can, with the feedback from our wellbeing leaders and family engagement leaders, that we can perhaps refine and target those a little bit more strongly as well, so that they're meeting the needs of staff in our school communities as well. So I think there's a very good intention to keep that going, and certainly the feedback that we've had both through the seminar series or the webinar series and the updates has been fantastic, and we're really pleased to hear not only your feedback, but that work has been so supportive of what you've been doing with your schools and your students as well.
And you've hit on something really important there, Lena, that feedback, because we're working remotely, we absolutely rely on feedback mainly from schools, because we're not on that daily conversation with families or in that space. So when it comes to families, but certainly when it comes to what do staff need to support them in this, we really need that feedback from student wellbeing leaders as our key contact, or whoever else is able to provide it, because it really helps us target more precisely what the needs are, or hope to target that.
Thank you. We've got a pretty fundamental question here, and I'll take a stab at it to start with, and you definitely have some ideas as well. This one's about how do you go about building staff capacity to engage with families? That's a really critical question, isn't it? I think firstly it's a really important thing, but it's something that needs to be seen as something that needs professional learning that's taken quite seriously by the school or the cluster. And certainly our implementation guide will talk about the different ways in which you might approach that. One thing we've seen happen is that it seems to be helpful when there's a group of educators, whether they're within the same school or within a district or a cluster, that can share their own learnings that have happened, take some time out to do reading or some trialing some things, and then coming together and sharing what learnings they've had. I don't know if there's anything particular that your educators could tap into throughout your diocese there.
I think Narelle and Veronica, you'd be really well placed to respond to that question, considering the vast amount of work that's happened over the last 10 years in the family engagement space. So Narelle and Veronica, I might ask you to draw on some of that and share that as part of the response.
Thanks, Lena. Yeah, and I'm aware that there's a number of people who have been engaged in the Family School Partnerships work through Catholic Ed for a long time in the audience, if you like, today as well. So there's a wealth of experience in our system, and that really comes from a really long history of looking at family and community engagement at a system level as well as an individual level. And I think that that systemic sort of approach is really important. So one of the roles that Catholic Ed take on is, I suppose, delivering professional learning and thinking about resource development that will support and build understanding and awareness across the system. But there are so many things at a school or a more local level that schools could be doing and are doing brilliantly. And one of the things you mentioned, Barbara, is that idea of learning together or learning from each other. There's lots of different clustering and collaborative arrangements that support and build capacity of classroom teachers. A number of us were involved in a program called Family-Centred Classroom Practices, where teachers worked together, classroom teachers worked together through a reflective practice cycle to think about how they can improve their engagement of families and really build their own skills and confidence in that area. There's also things like the ARACY standards from a leadership perspective, thinking about teacher goals and professional learning development, looking at targeting particular areas of the ARACY standards 3.7 and 7.3, particularly those areas where families may not be as connected to the individual teachers, and teachers can actually use those as a learning goal or a development goal to be working with other colleagues in their school, to be thinking about how they might be able to do that. But it does require permission, I suppose, and support from a leadership level down to make sure that it's a priority across the school, and making time and space for teachers to be able to do that and not just learn about it, but also practice their skills. Veronica, did you have something there?
I think you've probably covered a lot of that already, Narelle, particularly I was heading towards the thought that it's very difficult to do without the support and the permission, as you use that word rightly, from school leaders. So where it's in policy that this is part of the way we work. You talked before, Barb, about core business of schools, and once it's core business, then it becomes part of what we do, which should support teachers to know that it's part of what they need to learn around all capacity. I think we have examples of schools where the leader is the person who drives that. In this school, this is how we work. So those schools are much more effective, and found very quickly in this COVID, remote learning time, that they were also having wonderful, positive relationships with parents. One school in particular I can think of where the leader just drives this with a passion. Teachers reported certainly early on that this was a school in a low SES area, a school that you would think they would have had many kids on site because home learning circumstances were difficult. They had no children at home. The school had supported every family in whatever way was possible so that every child could be at school. And every teacher, whether their capacity, some of them were new on board, but the surrounding supports within the school enabled them to very quickly pick up the learning of the school and the ethos of the school, and they learned from each other, right, this is how we're going to do it, because we're all learning on the spot. So it was really definitely a case of the school culture enables this. And that's critical. The culture enables the building of staff capacity, which doesn't answer the question directly, but it certainly, you know, guides us towards thinking about what are we doing within our enabling section of our thinking in terms of Excel that supports everyone to have capacity to learn and build and certainly learn from each other. So there's even that idea of moving within each other's classrooms to see how do you do this. And I think now is actually a really good time to practice some of those things where teachers have built amazing technological skills very quickly and could still employ them by inviting parents into the classroom for minutes of the day, or have kids with their little devices connect with mum or dad for 2 minutes here or 3 minutes there, or there's ways that they could build that safe capacity again, that capacity to feel safe to do this in a continued way.
And I think also, Veronica, to highlight that we're continually working in this space and developing resources to support school leaders, and the upcoming release of the Horizons of Hope statement around families as partners will be absolutely crucial in that to provide even further guidance. And the redevelopment of the new policy from CEM, which is again restating and affirming the centrality of family and community partnerships as part of our work in who we are as Catholic education. So they're all pending and hopefully will be released by the end of the term, if not at the beginning of term 3. So they provide a catalyst for, again, I suppose, refreshing the conversation and really having a focus and a highlight on family and community engagement again.
Yeah, that's great. Exactly, Lena. And when we think about perhaps some of the students with particular learning needs, we make amazing efforts to engage with families around that. And I think there's some learning that can come from that too, that we can build on and strengthen in the ways that we approach all students in this work. So that supports, again, what we're saying in those statements.
Just quickly, there's a couple more questions and I'm just conscious of the time. So we've got about a few minutes left. So let's answer, well, there's a comment here that's a question, more of a comment. Could we also learn and connect across schools to gain ideas, practices with each other? So I think we've touched on that. That's a wonderful idea. Other than surveys, what are the other ways of capturing the experiences of children, parents and staff? I think that's a great question because I feel like it's sort of the world is your oyster response, but that's not very helpful either. And I think it does come down to things like ages and stages of children and families. So I can imagine you'd approach that quite differently if you had very, very early learning kind of children as opposed to your kids in secondary and later years of primary perhaps. Would any of you have any ideas there that you would have heard of or would want to mention? Narelle, you're kind of not...
Yeah, I'm actually thinking of some of the work that some of our colleagues in schools are doing right now, and they're collating and capturing some of the experiences from a teacher's experience, a teacher's perspective, a family perspective, and potentially and hopefully a student perspective around a whole range of experiences. So these are people who are, acting as cluster engagement leaders or family engagement leaders who've been working in the space and continue to collaborate. And I'm aware a number are still in the room today. But capturing stories, I think, is a really key part of it, to be able to gather not just the answers to survey questions, but really going to the heart of what that experience has been and finding ways to share that across our schools. So that's one way I was thinking, and within the school as well. And the other way that I'm thinking of is another strategy that we've used quite extensively in Catholic Ed called community conversations, which is a dialogue process and a way of having conversations with different groupings of people, ensuring that students, families, teachers all have a voice in being able to talk about what experiences have been like, share learnings and insights in a different way than, again, filling in a survey. So they're just a couple of thoughts that occur to me in terms of the idea of capturing stories and sharing insights in a way through a relationship, I suppose.
And I think if anything we've learned from this, or been reminded of actually rather than learned, I think, is that teachers are incredibly, incredibly creative, and out of the blue created things that were quite amazing. And if you've sat on the other side of the screen in terms of families, you sit there going, oh yeah, that's actually really good. I mean, there was some stuff that was just ordinary stuff, but there was some incredible creative stuff. So teachers probably have the answers up their sleeves more than they know. But I'm prompted again, Narelle, to think of capturing stories through art at all ages. That would be wonderful to have, perhaps a display of, you know, learning from home art, what do you call them? Shows, art galleries. Perhaps there will be plays that are made up about this. Perhaps there will be songs. We've seen many schools use song and technology. Those creative ways, I think, are highly valid for school communities to celebrate within themselves what's been great, and to capture the stories and pass them on for generations to look back on and go, that was an amazing time.
I think also giving voice to families and to students and asking them how may they like to share their story as well of what their experience has been. So moving away from the assumption of this is what we can do, and really opening it up to how might we, what might their contribution be. I think that's going to be really essential. So generate the ideas from within, rather than going with a predetermined list of this is how we're going to do it.
Excellent.
And if I may chip in from the sidelines, let social media do its work as well at spreading the word beyond the strict parent-school relationship.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think we might wrap it up there. Thank you again for the opportunity to do some presenting for you this afternoon, and I think this discussion has been really, really rich and insightful. Lena, did you want to say a few words?
Just in finishing off, thanks very much, Barb, for your presentation this afternoon, and for just your openness in the way that you have worked with us and planned with us, particularly over the last week. You have been, it's been a real pleasure working with you and ARACY, and we really value the partnership with you. And I think just in reflection, a closing comment, that I think if there is any type of silver lining that has come from this COVID-19 experience, is that it's really provided us, as you've said during your presentation, with a golden opportunity to really reset the relationship between schools and families, and to really demonstrate the power of family engagement, because we're not really going to be able to harness the power of technology if we don't simultaneously, I think, reinvest or invest in realising the potential of the relationship between schools and families as well. So thank you for highlighting those key messages to us this afternoon, and we look forward to ongoing work with ARACY, and hopefully, as we said to you earlier in the week, that we may be able to host you in Melbourne in the not too distant future for one of our seminars with school communities as well. So thank you, Barb, thanks Narelle, and thanks Veronica. Certainly also thanks to all the participants who have been online today, and we'll make this presentation available on Kevin hopefully in the next few days as well. So thanks everyone for your engagement this afternoon.
Thanks very much, ladies. Take care, everybody, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barb. Bye.